Hi there, my name is Orestes Ponce de Leon, and you are listening to the Cobra Effect podcast. In this show, I cover the unintended consequences of government policies throughout history. We delve into 4,000 years of how even the best intentioned ideas can backfire, leading to revolt, failure, and shocking events. In this first part, we travel 1,700 years to the Roman Empire. The Emperor Diocletian tried to curb inflation and, to this end, issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in the year 301. It was a detailed list trying to control 1,400 prices and salaries, including products like camel hair, vulture feathers, and loincloth. But there's more. Prices of loincloth for first, second, and third quality. But why did Diocletian need to be so detailed? Why would a man who claimed to be the son of the god Jupiter be concerned with the price of camel hair? Because inflation was a disease killing the empire. This is a long 8-part episode covering the 300 years of the early Roman Empire, also known as the Principate, a period that ranges from the moment the Republic transformed into the Empire under Augustus in 27 BC to the moment Diocletian took the throne in the year 284 and the late Roman Empire, also known as the Dominate, begins. Through this series, we will learn in detail how the Roman state worked for the 300 years of the early empire, and how, as public expenses kept increasing and the sources of revenue kept decreasing, debasement and inflation followed. Today, we will see one of the public expenditure programs that led to inflation. We will go into detail today to learn about the free distribution of food in the empire, its origins, some numbers to put in perspective the colossal effort it represented, how it expanded over time to more than just grain and to more than just the city of Rome, and finally how it all ended. In the second part in 2 weeks, we will discuss the imperial expenditure on public spectacles, which was also an important part of daily life in the city of Rome and the empire. In the third part, we will discuss 2 other imperial expenses, handouts as gifts in cash, and public construction works. In the fourth episode, we continue exploring the remaining expenditure items, the state bureaucracy, and the largest expense of all, the military. In the fifth part, we will touch on whether the Roman Empire could finance these public expenses through public debt, and whether the empire lost or gained money through trade. We will also talk about the short-term or unpredictable sources of revenue to cover these expenses. I am referring to mining, the spoils of war, and confiscations from the wealthy elite. Later, in the 6th and 7th parts, we will see the subjects of taxes and treasuries respectively, as they were long-term or more predictable sources of revenue. Finally, in the 8th and last part, we will talk about debasement, inflation, Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, and why it failed. As we advance through these 8 parts and make progress in understanding the full picture, the issues discussed will become more complex and the episodes will grow longer. Although I originally wrote a short, non-academic article in 2021 about the subject, I did not expect to go way deeper and spend the last 2 years writing this script. But one topic led to another and so on. Writing this series is perhaps an intellectual debt I owe myself as a kid, when in 1997, a special issue of National Geographic about Rome found its way to me, and I fell in love with Roman history. My expectation for this series is to share with you all the facts I learned and the same sense of amazement I felt with every page of every article and book I read for this script. Although Diocletian's failed Edict of price and wage control is the main unintended consequence of this 8-part episode of the Cura Effect podcast. Along the way, we will see other examples of unintended consequences of public policies in ancient Roman times. So, let's begin. I collect ancient coins, and Roman coinage is my favorite. One could say that, in general, as inflation crippled the Roman economy and the empire itself, Roman coins lost their artistic beauty. When you compare a piece issued by Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century to another issued by Honorius in the early 5th century, you can clearly see that something went wrong. On the one hand, when Trajan died in the year 117, ruling over the empire's largest territorial extent, the Senate declared him Optimus Princeps, meaning the best ruler. On the other hand, Honorius' incompetent reign saw Rome sacked for the first time in 800 years, when the Visigoths took the city in the year 410. Between these two emperors, if you organize Roman coins in chronological order, a clear pattern emerges. Their artistic quality progressively declines as the empire itself. Although there are some exceptions, such as the usurper posthumous gold aureus. Let me say this in case there's a fellow numismatist listening to this episode. While it is true that emperors' portraits changed in style, from a realistic, individualized style to an abstract, generic portrayal, Roman coinage artistry became a shadow of itself over time. By Honorius' time in the early 400s, all emperors looked cartoonish. There are several reasons for this. First, it takes a lot of skills to make a beautiful coin, and skilled die engravers are needed to pass and nurture the craftsmanship to the next generation. As war and economic decline were the norm during the 3rd century, this was lost, especially in provincial mints. The second reason is that, to face the challenges posed by foreign invasions and domestic usurpers, emperors and usurpers alike opened more mints near areas of conflict to pay soldiers. Obviously, these mints did not employ the best engravers. A third reason is that, to cover the always growing imperial expenditure, Roman rulers periodically debased the coinage. Reducing the amount of silver in a coin allowed more coins to be minted. Millions and millions of newly struck coins did not require an exquisite design. On the contrary, a simple design was enough. As a result, skilled engravers were not required. War, debasement, and government expenditure are part of the narrative to understand the reasons behind the loss of coinage artistry, but they are also part of the process of Roman inflation. Now, this is very important to organize our thoughts on such a complex subject and understand why inflation was Rome's public enemy number one by the time Diocletian took the throne in the year 284. As a general trend, military and public expenditures had always been increasing. Public expenditures such as imperial handouts and gifts in cash, the state bureaucracy, public construction works, public games, and the free distribution of food we will see in today's episode. To cover these ever-increasing expenses, there were specific sources of imperial income, such as mining precious metals, the spoils of war, and the confiscation of senatorial property. But how many times a year are you going to sack an enemy city or take away the property of someone? These sources of revenue were neither constant nor everlasting, like, for example, with mining. So, as a somewhat more reliable way to cover the expenditure, the Roman emperors raised some taxes, depleted the treasury, and debased the currency. As a result, when Diocletian took the throne in the year 284, inflation was already undermining the foundations of the empire. We have to keep in mind that the Roman state, unlike modern states, was unable to finance itself and cover deficits through public debt. I will cover all these subjects in this 8-part series in the order I mentioned earlier. Today, Let's talk about one of the main imperial expenditure items, the free distribution of food. And let's go back to Roman coins. There is an expensive one I would love to have that was struck under Emperor Nero in the year 65. It is a bronze sestertius. Just for clarification, because you will hear about them throughout this series, 4 of these bronze sesterces were worth 1 silver denarius, and 100 bronze sesterces were worth 1 gold aureus. So the obverse of this coin shows Nero, and the reverse shows the Roman goddess of agriculture Ceres and the goddess Annona, who was the divine personification of the grain supply imported to the city of Rome. The legend reads, Annona Augusti, something translated as food or grain provided by the emperor. You see, coins were the most effective means of mass propaganda back then. Everybody had them in their hands to witness that the emperor was providing for them, taking care of them, and that food abundance was the divine provision of Nero himself. Not only Nero, but lots of emperors also minted coins with Annona on the reverse. Now, this system of government-sponsored grain supply to the city of Rome, the Cura Annonae in Latin, or care of the grain in English, started in the times of the Republic. First, it was a temporary emergency measure in times of scarcity to avoid famine in the city of Rome. When needed, grain was imported from allies and trade partners and distributed free or at a subsidized price. Let's remember that, in pre-industrial times, a prolonged drought was a serious matter. Added to this, widespread slavery meant that many freemen faced job insecurity and were competing for low-salaried jobs, which in the context of food insecurity with grain prices going up, meant starvation and famine. However, the distribution of grain became a permanent state expenditure when, in the year 123 BC, the tribune Gaius Gracchus passed a law guaranteeing each male Roman citizen the right to buy a monthly ration of grain at a low price. When I say grain, I mean almost always wheat, the staple food of the Romans. In Latin, frumentum meant grain, especially cereal crops like wheat or barley. This distribution of grain/wheat, first subsidized and later free, as we will see, is known as frumentatio, and those receiving the grain were called plebs frumentaria. But for the sake of simplicity, I will use in this episode the term Cura Annonae, care of the grain, to refer to the whole operation of supplying Rome with grain, since the moment the fields of Egypt and North Africa were taxed, to its monthly distribution on the streets of the capital city. Although initially with good intentions and with some bumps along the road throughout the Republic, the Cura Annonae became an expenditure that snowballed all the way until the end of the empire. The dictator Sulla abolished the distribution of grain in the year 82 BC, only to be made free by the tribune Claudius in the year 58 BC. From that moment, the number of people receiving the grain handout rose to 320,000. Only to be reduced by Julius Caesar to 150,000. Then Augustus became emperor in the year 27 BC. Augustus managed to slightly increase the number of recipients of the free grain dole to 200,000, and this was approximately the number of recipients for the next 4 centuries of empire. Now, we have to transport ourselves 2,000 years back in time to understand that grain was to antiquity what oil is to our modern world. Let me illustrate this with some examples. The 2nd century AD Roman historian Appian tells us that in 39 BC, Sextus Pompey was at war with Octavian and Mark Antony. Sextus controlled Sicily, one of the 2 grain suppliers to the city of Rome. On top of this, Sextus' fleet blocked grain shipments coming from the province of Africa Proconsularis in modern Tunisia, the other major grain supplier. As a result, famine loomed over Rome. A protest broke, and Octavian went to the Forum to talk to the angry mob. It was in vain. He was stoned and wounded by the rioters. It was only when Mark Antony ordered his legionaries to punish the mob that a blood-stained Octavian was rescued. The situation forced Octavian and Mark Antony to seek peace with Sextus and bend to his request. Later on, Octavian defeated Sextus and defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and went on to rule as the first emperor under the name of Augustus. The next emperor, Tiberius, in a letter to the Senate, mentioned that the duty of supplying Rome with the grain depended on the emperor himself, and that, and I quote, "if it is neglected, the utter ruin of the state will follow." End of quote. The 1st century Roman historian Tacitus tells us how, in the winter of 51, people rioted in the city of Rome again due to a shortage of grain. There were only 15 days of supply left. The angry mob surrounded Emperor Claudius in the Forum and pelted him with stale crusts of bread. He was rescued by his troops, who hurried him to the palace. At least, the people threw bread at Claudius and not rocks as they had done to Octavian. A final example: Herodian and Cassius Dio, two Roman historians who were contemporaries of the reign of Commodus, tell us that in the year 190, the people gathered in the Circus Maximus began protesting the shortage of grain. They blamed the all-powerful Praetorian prefect Cleander for manipulating grain supplies for profit. Cleander, the right-hand man of Emperor Commodus, sent the Praetorian guards to suppress the riot. A ferocious street battle ensued, and Cleander's men were soon overpowered. The angry mob went to the palace to demand that Emperor Commodus take action. Herodian tells us the following, and I quote, "He was terrified by this pressing danger, which did not merely threaten, but was already upon him. In his panic, he sent for Cleander. The prefect appeared. Commodus ordered him seized and beheaded, and impaling his head on a long spear, sent it out to the mob, to whom it was a welcome and long-desired sight." End of quote. Afraid of the mob, Commodus not only got rid of Cleander, but also of his two sons and all his friends. By the way, this happened in other cities of the empire, not only in Rome. For example, the Greek sophist Philostratus tells us two stories in this regard. In the first one, at some point during the 1st century AD, the city of Aspendus in modern Turkey suffered from famine, and I quote, "for the rich men had shut up all the grain and were holding it up for export from the country." End of quote. Not fully aware of this, the people blamed the governor, and I quote, "An excited crowd of all ages had set upon the governor and were lighting a fire to burn him alive, although he was clinging to the statues of the emperor." End of quote. The good news is that the situation was resolved. On the second occasion, Philostratus tells us that in the Athens of the 2nd century AD, there was a shortage of bread, and that the governor, a man named Lollianus, became the target of popular anger, and I quote, "Once when a riot arose in the bread sellers' quarter, and the Athenians were on the point of stoning Lollianus, Pancrates the Cynic came forward before the Athenians and, by simply remarking, 'Lollianus does not sell bread but words,' he so diverted the Athenians that they let fall the stones that were in their hands." End of quote. Here again, the situation was resolved, and the city governor of Athens saved his life. As we can see, for emperors themselves and city governors alike, the supply of grain was a serious business. Then, how did the Roman state pay for the grain dole distributed in the capital? First, Most of the grain was collected as a form of tax from Sardinia, Sicily, Northern Africa, and Egypt. One may think, okay, then nobody was actually paying for it. Well, these regions were paying for it. Someone had to cultivate the soil and harvest all that grain. This meant labor and resources. So, instead of paying actual money, like silver or gold, these regions paid in a different way. They were paying this tax in kind, in addition to all the other taxes in money they had to pay, apart from the Cura Annonae. Second, a fund from the imperial coffers was allocated specifically to the logistics behind this operation, and without doubt, the Cura Annonae was the single most complex commercial operation in the empire. The office of the Praefectus Annonae, the prefect of the grain, was in charge of paying for the shipment, storage, and distribution. We're talking about paying the private merchants who owned the ships involved in this operation, as well as many laborers. The Praefectus Annonae was also in charge of a sizable bureaucracy of auditors, accountants, administrators, etc., and these were many people who were paid from the Fiscus Frumentarius, a specific part of the imperial treasury to cover all these expenses. By the way, a brief parenthesis, the frumentarii were the military officers in charge of supplying the grain to the legions in the provinces, and it seems to the civilians in Rome. This required them to constantly travel between the provinces and the capital city Rome, where they were quartered in the Castra Peregrina, a fort on the Caelian hill. Since the provincial governor was ultimately in charge of paying and feeding the army, the frumentarii, as grain supply officers who had to constantly travel, also served as couriers between the provincial authorities and the capital city Rome, having the perfect alibi to go everywhere without raising suspicion, and on top of it, handling sensitive information. It became a matter of time for the frumentarii to also become spies at the service of the emperor. Modern scholars debate whether this happened during the reign of Trajan, who ruled from the years 98 to 117, or a decade earlier under Domitian. The Historia Augusta, a collection of biographies written much later in the 4th century AD, sometimes exaggerated but with some juicy stories, tells us about Emperor Hadrian that, and I quote, "His vigilance was not confined to his own household, but extended to those of his friends, and by means of his private agents, the frumentarii, he even pried into all their secrets, and so skillfully that they were never aware that the emperor was acquainted with their private lives until he revealed it himself." End of quote. Hadrian ruled in the early 100s AD, and 1 century later, Emperor Macrinus used them to spy on his soldiers. 50 years later, Emperor Gallienus used them to spy on one of his military commanders, Claudius Gothicus. However, Claudius Gothicus replaced Gallienus, so the frumentarii did not fulfill their duty. In addition to this role, within a sort of imperial intelligence apparatus, the frumentarii were used to clean the competition. And I say clean sarcastically. In the turbulent year 193, the year of the 5 emperors, it seems Didius Julianus sent one of them to assassinate Septimius Severus, but it didn't work out when the frumentarii switched sides. 2 years later, Septimius Severus was the one to unsuccessfully employ a messenger, probably a frumentarii, to remove Claudius Albinus from the struggle for power. In addition to spying and serving as tools for political assassinations, the frumentarii were employed as military police, which made them the subject of stories of abuse and plunder in the provinces. By the end of the 3rd century AD, Diocletian disbanded their unit, perhaps because they became unpopular and dangerous, or perhaps simply because they were no longer needed as supply officers of the grain or as imperial couriers. Emperor Diocletian reformed the way in-kind taxes were raised for the Cura Annonae, and it was probably he who created a new imperial courier department. Now, let's go back to the Cura Annonae, and let me put it in perspective. Given the scarcity of ancient sources, the following numbers are part of an ongoing academic debate, but they can still provide some perspective. Augustus set the number of beneficiaries to 200,000 free-born male Roman citizens. Now, each of them, acting as the head of the household, received 5 modi of wheat every month. The modius was a Roman unit of measurement, and 5 modi of wheat per month represented 33.5 kilograms, or its equivalent 74 pounds. So, each one of the 200,000 Roman male citizens received 74 pounds of wheat every month. Given the total number of beneficiaries receiving the Cura Annonae, how much grain was individually distributed, and the average human adult consumption in calories, the distribution of free grain could have fulfilled the needs of up to 400,000 adult people. Keep this number in mind, 400,000 people. Of course, they would have needed other sources of nutrition, but cereals were the main staple and accounted for up to 65% of the average Roman diet, according to the Smithsonian. And wheat was a much more consumed and preferred cereal than barley, for example. Now, it is estimated that the city of Rome had between 1.2 million and 800,000 inhabitants, which means that the imperial treasury was feeding between a third and a half of the whole capital. That's what 400,000 people fed by the grain dole represented. Over the 4,000 years of human urbanization before Rome became an empire, almost certainly no city in the world reached 400,000 inhabitants. For example, the largest estimates suggest that at their peaks, the wealthy cities of Babylon and the enlightened Athens may have had only half as many inhabitants. Even at its peak a few centuries earlier, the other superpower and enemy of Rome in the Mediterranean, Carthage, had the same number of 400,000 people, which is the largest estimate. By the time of the Cura Annonae, the second and third largest cities of the Roman Empire were Alexandria and Antioch, each with an estimated population of around 400,000 and 120,000 respectively. This means that the Cura Annonae could have sustained by itself the second largest city of the empire and a few times over the population of the third largest city. Outside of Roman territories, in all the long 5 centuries of the Cura Annonae, the other places in the whole world with a city population that could have reached at some point something close to the amount of people fed by the Cura Annonae were 4 cities. Ctesiphon, capital of the Parthian and then later Sasanian empires in what is now Iraq, Pataliputra, which was capital of multiple empires in what is now modern India, and Chang'an first and Luoyang later as capital cities of the Chinese Han Dynasty. However, even if these cities reached a population of 400,000, this was for a limited period, not throughout the almost 5 centuries of Roman free grain distribution. Also, these were the world's superpowers at the time, and India and China had enormous populations, then and now. A final point. It would take Europe around 1,200 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire to have a city with a population above 400,000. I am talking about London and Paris, which reached more than 400,000 inhabitants in the second half of the 1600s. If European urbanization took that long to reach the level of complexity to support that many inhabitants, imagine being able to almost feed that population for 5 centuries. After all, a city grows only if it's able to feed itself. The Cura Annonae was a massive, well-oiled machine. 60 modi of grain per person a year for 200,000 recipients equals 12 million modi a year for the city of Rome. This is 180 million pounds of grain. Historian and Stanford professor Walter Scheidel estimates that after the grain was collected from the provinces, and I quote, "If we take account of transportation and storage costs, which also had to be borne by the state, an effective annual cost well in excess of 50 million sesterces seems plausible." End of quote. To put it in perspective, this represents 10% of military costs in salaries and benefits before Emperor Domitian increased military expenditure in the year 84. After this military increase, the Cura Annonae to the city of Rome represented around 7.5% of military expenses. And what if I tell you that, as time passed, the Cura Annonae was increased, both in variety of products and extension of fortunate cities receiving it? Around the year 200, probably under Septimius Severus, wheat was replaced by bread. Now think of this. Wheat can be stored and distributed monthly. Bread has to be baked and distributed more or less every day. Groundbreaking technology was used to mill all the grain in state-owned mills powered by aqueducts. Added to the list of laborers, administrators, and merchants that the imperial coffers had to pay, we now have the bakers and more people behind the process of grinding the grain and distributing it to the bakeries in the city. It was Septimius Severus who also added olive oil to the program of food distribution, and under Emperor Aurelian, who ruled between the years 270 and 275, wine and salted or cured pork were added, although with a less systematic distribution. In addition to bread, we're now talking about olive oil, wine, and pork. Furthermore, the Cura Annonae was significantly expanded to other beneficiaries under the reign of Emperor Probus, who ascended to the throne in the year 276, just 1 year after Emperor Aurelian had added pork and wine to the food distribution. Under Probus, the grain distribution system was extended beyond the capital city of Rome to include the empire's other 2 most populous cities, Alexandria and Antioch. When Diocletian became emperor some years later in 284, the Cura Annonae had transitioned from wheat to bread, now included olive oil, wine, and pork, and had extended beyond Rome to Alexandria and Antioch. It is worth mentioning that some years after Diocletian's rule, Emperor Constantine the Great granted the right to a free grain dole to new houses in Constantinople, with the intention of populating the new capital in the east. Constantinople, then known as Nova Roma, New Rome, received grain from Egypt, while the city of Rome relied on its main supply from northern Africa. Even as the Western Roman Empire was crumbling during the 5th century AD, the food dole remained in place. By then, although the city of Rome still had tremendous symbolic importance, the Western Empire's administrative capital had been moved twice already. First, in 286, Diocletian moved the western capital from Rome to Mediolanum, modern Milan. In 401, Honorius moved the capital from Mediolanum to Ravenna. As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, it was under Honorius' incompetent reign that Rome was sacked for the first time in 800 years, when the Visigoths took the city in the year 410, Even after all of this, we have records of the food dole being distributed in the city of Rome. The Oxford Classical Dictionary tells us that, and I quote, "The recipients of the distribution of pork, and probably bread as well, numbered 120,000 in the year 419." End of quote. Now, you may think that all of this effort was to help the poor. After all, the Cura Annonae was designed during the Republic to prevent starvation in times of crisis. Well, no. I mentioned before that recipients of the free grain were a specific social class named plebs frumentarii. Although not wealthy, they certainly were privileged. These were citizens of the city itself who had professional skills and a stable job. They were well connected in order to earn the right to the grain dole. With the tesserae frumentarii, which was like a ticket made of bronze or lead, they were able to collect their grain dole. Records from the 3rd century AD indicate that these tesserae frumentarii were inherited or sold. The actual program that helped the most those in need was called Alimenta. First in the ancient Greek world and later in the Roman world, the wealthy practiced euergetism, a term coined by French historian André Boulanger in 1923, meaning something like to do good deeds, which derives from the Greek word euergetes, translated as benefactors. Charity and donations of money or food or construction works were the way the wealthy elite helped the poor, whether out of the goodness of their hearts or out of interest to gain prestige and political high offices. Plutarch, the Greek philosopher and historian who lived in the time of the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD, said that, and I quote, "The masses hate a rich man who does not share his property more than a poor man who steals public property." End of quote. Now, Alimenta was a state-sponsored form of charity that started on the emperors Nerva and or Trajan around the end of the 1st century AD. Classics historian Frank C. Bourne summarizes the Alimenta program as follows, and I quote, "The poor young people from the Italian towns and villages each month were furnished sufficient funds for food and clothing until they reached the age of 15 years. To finance the necessary expenditures, the government prevailed upon landowners in each municipality to accept loans of imperial funds at an annual interest of 5%, and these loans were in sufficient quantity that the income therefrom would satisfy the local needs." End of quote. To sum it up, the interest from those loans was used to help the poor kids from Italian cities and towns. A very smart strategy indeed. Unfortunately, Emperor Aurelian, the same who added pork and wine to the Cura Annonae, ended the Alimenta program during his reign, sometime between 270 and 275 AD. But going back to the Cura Annonae, the fact that the city of Rome relied so heavily on the state's grain supply meant that when the state weakened, the grain supply faltered as well. With it, the city was abandoned en masse. Let's remember that grain was to the ancient world what oil is to us today. This is an unintended consequence of the Cura Annonae policy, a cobra effect in itself. As I mentioned earlier, 9 years after the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, 120,000 of the city's inhabitants continued to receive the free food. But in 429, another Germanic people like the Visigoths, the Vandals, together with the Alans, who were of Iranian descent, started to campaign in northern Africa. Under the leadership of Genseric, they conquered city after city, until 10 years later, in 439, they took Carthage. The rich and fertile hinterlands that for centuries fed Rome were now in the hands of the Vandals. It was from Carthage that Rome received most of the wheat, olive oil, and salted pork. Rome fought back, but to no avail. In 442, a treaty was signed between Genseric and the Roman Emperor Valentinian III. Rome recovered some areas to the west of North Africa, while the Vandals kept the richest and most productive northern African provinces. In the provinces that Valentinian III recovered, taxes were reduced to 1/8 of the previous level, that is, only 12.5% of what they had been before the barbarian incursions. The in-kind tax of grain, the annona, was lowered to 80% of what it was before. Such was the devastation of more than a decade of war and the raids of the Vandals. This is where the word vandalism comes from. Genseric probably shipped some grain to Rome from his newly conquered territories, but it certainly was not enough. He had to feed his own people and give them land. Furthermore, the Vandal kingdom lacked the bureaucratic apparatus and supply chains that Rome had perfected over centuries to support the Cura Annonae. In just over a century, as the city of Rome first lost to Constantinople the grain supply from Egypt, and then lost the vast majority of the grain from northern Africa, the Eternal City went from having around 1 million inhabitants in the early 300s to somewhere between 1/4 to 500,000 in the 450s, just a decade after the Vandals took control of northern Africa. In any case, in 455, the Vandals of Genseric systematically sacked Rome for 2 weeks. For comparison, in 410, the Visigoths had sacked Rome for 3 days. Almost a century later, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian the Great and his generals Belisarius and Narses fought the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Italy for control of the Italian peninsula. The city of Rome was fiercely disputed. As a result, by the 560s, the city that 2.5 centuries before had housed 1 million people now had shelter for as few as 25,000 inhabitants. It was the final blow to a depopulation process that started when the Eternal City lost its main fuel, the Cura Annonae. In the future of this 8-part series, we will learn more about how other expenditures led to the inflation that Emperor Diocletian tried to address by controlling the prices of camel hair, vulture's feathers, loincloth, and other 1,400 products and salaries with his Edict on maximum prices in the year 301. As in the phrase bread and circuses, today we talked about the bread part. Tune in for the next episode to know more about the circus part of this expression. We will talk about the free public gains as a relevant imperial expenditure item. Thank you for listening. For additional information and social media links, you can visit thecobraeffectpodcast.com. You can support the show on Buy Me a Coffee or become a monthly member. Links on the website. You help me to cover my costs, and your contribution keeps this project going. Feel free to also reach out via social media or email. The email address is contact@thecobraeffectpodcast.com. I would like to hear your questions, comments, or ideas for a future topic. See you in 2 weeks for another episode of the Cobra Effect Podcast.